If your whole future could pivot in a single breath, would you want to hear it? With a bouquet in his hand and joy pounding in his chest, Alex lifted his knuckles to knock, then froze at his fiancée's laughter on the other side of the hotel door. By the time the truth finished speaking, the fairy tale would be ash, the aisle a battleground, and the only weapon he'd need was proof. The black sedan slid to a stop beneath the crescent of the seaside hotel's lights, wet pavement catching neon like spilled jewels, and out stepped Lucy Hale, tech heiress, charity board darling, the woman every camera learned to love on sight. With Brutus trotting at her heel, a compact bulldog built like a small fortress with thoughtful, flint-dark eyes. Moments later, the revolving doors breathed out Alex and Lavu in a careful thrift store suit whose seams held a month of hand-stitching and a cousin's late-night patience, the jacket a whisper too matte, the cuffs honest about every life he'd lived before this one, and he smiled the way men smile when their hope is bigger than the room. "You made it," she said, voice sugar-glass smooth, and he opened his arms with shy certainty, leaning in to kiss her cheek, only for Brutus to stiffen, release a warning growl, and spring forward to nip the hem of Alex's trousers so sharply that the valet flinched and the doorman forgot his script. "Brutus, no!" Lucy chided with a PR-perfect laugh that had soothed boardrooms and talk shows alike, tugging the leash as Alex stepped back in a flash of fear he tried to swallow with humor. "Tough crowd," he offered, smoothing fabric that suddenly seemed too thin for the night. "He's protective," Lucy said, the smile never cracking. "He'll adjust after the wedding." And in the mirrored elevator, the trio became a tableau. Lucy bright and airy with a gown bag that gleamed like bottled snow, Brutus a block of focus and suspicion, Alex a good man studying his own reflection as if a truth might be hiding in the knot of his tie. "After tomorrow it'll just be us," he tried, voice light but wanting. No cameras, no statements, just breathing. And she brushed a phantom speck from his lapel with fingers trained to look tender under flashbulbs. "Of course, babe, for now the brand needs a fairy tale." The doors opening on a suite that could have paid his year's rent twice. A ceiling of balloons tethered by curling ribbons, a halo of white roses, a sign in cursive gold, "Last night before you say I do," posed near a fortress of gifts and a glittering river of drinks, and Lucy glided from vignette to vignette, admiring the mise-en-scène as Brutus planted himself in a corner like a sentry and refused to blink at Alex. "It's beautiful," Alex said, because it was, and because saying so delayed the small bruise forming behind his ribs. And when his phone buzzed, Jack's name, 3 missed calls, a string of excited texts about a trumpet, a heart-shaped cake, and a last-minute bouquet, he kissed Lucy's cheek and promised 2 minutes, then slipped into the soft hush of the corridor with a grin big enough to light 10 more balloons, rehearsing the knock, the song cue, the laughter he wanted to give her like a wrapped box. And he was lifting his hand when the suite door turned into a speaker and carried a sound he hadn't been invited to hear, Lucy's laughter, bright and effortless, a sound that sold out product lines. Then the practiced cadence she used for strategy calls. "It's adorable, really. He photographs like charity. It humanizes me," she said to someone whose voice Alex couldn't yet place, and the bouquet's tissue rustled as his hand lowered. "Yes, Michael, the schedule's locked. Vows, kiss, PR blast, and a Monday morning headline. After that, I pivot. The audience will be primed." And the hallway seemed to lean under his shoes as if the building had quietly chosen a side. Jack and 2 groomsmen turning the corner with the trumpet player and a volunteer with a cake shaped like a red heart, their grins freezing into question marks as Alex stilled, the door's seam leaking every syllable. "No, he won't suspect anything," Lucy continued, airy and efficient. "Brutus will settle once the noise dies down." And the irony cut clean. Brutus hated liars and had chosen his hill early. So Alex took a breath that tasted like metal and put his thumb to the voice recorder on his phone, because a man can forgive being broke or being mocked, but not being turned into content. He didn't slam the door or throw the bouquet or demand the world be different. He only listened long enough to hear the shape of the plan and the name that tethered it, Michael. And when the laughter softened and the call ended, he slid the phone back into his pocket alongside a hope now bruised but not dead, turned to Jack with a face that made the trumpet player lower his instrument, and said, almost politely, "Change of plan," and returned to the elevator where his reflection no longer looked like a groom, but like a witness. And upstairs Brutus lifted his head before the keycard beeped, as if a verdict had just been delivered in a language only dogs know. Alex scratched between the bulldog's ears. "Thanks for trying," he whispered, surprising himself with the steadiness of it, while Lucy drifted from roses to ribbon, a queen in a castle of good lighting, and somewhere far below, the ocean kept breathing its old, indifferent breath. Alex's knuckles hovered inches from the polished wood, bouquet sweating dye into the tissue paper, when Lucy's voice slid through the seam with the ease of someone used to being overheard and never contradicted, bright, edged, almost musical. "It's adorable, Michael. He photographs like charity. It humanizes me," she said, and the corridor's velvet quiet seemed to tilt beneath Alex's shoes as though the hotel itself had exhaled in surprise. He didn't move, not when a housekeeper's cart chimed past with bottles that winked, not when Jack and two groomsmen eased into view, shepherding a trumpet player and a heart-shaped cake with sugar roses, their grins faltering at the sight of him statuesque before a door that had turned into a speaker. Yes, the schedule's locked," Lucy continued, conversationally efficient, like she was arranging flowers, not futures. "Vows under the arch, kiss on cue, PR blast at 15 past the hour, and a Monday morning headline. We ride the swell, and then I pivot." The word landed like a slick coin. Alex's fingers tightened around the bouquet until a petal sighed and gave up. This could not be about him, he thought, because the votes he'd cast in favor of them were too sincere to be counted wrongly. "No," Michael's voice replied, tinny across speakerphone and smug with proximity. "And the post-nup?" A beat. "Massaged," Lucy said lightly, like a seamstress talking about hems. "My lawyer tucked a few kindnesses into it." And somewhere down the hall, a door latched with a precise click that sounded uncomfortably like agreement. Alex's first instinct, the one born in men who were raised to be gentle even when the floor falls away, was not to burst in or bang or name the betrayal. It was to listen until the shape of the thing he feared became specific enough to carry without breaking his hands, and so he slipped his phone from his pocket, thumb trembling like a wire in wind, opened the voice recorder and held it to the seam, not because he was hungry for spectacle, but because truth has always needed witnesses who don't look away. "He's kind, but small. He's used to small." And the bouquet slid against his palm with a papery shh, like a dress turning in a mirror. Jack mouthed, "Are you okay?" And Alex gave the smallest no anyone had ever given while still standing. "Brutus will settle once the noise dies down," Lucy added, a small laugh undercutting her certainty. And the irony landed clean. Brutus, who had not settled, whose growls had read the room correctly from the first hello. "After we post, after the interviews, after the fairytale language," she said, the air quotes audible. "We keep it tasteful, we cite irreconcilable differences, and step away. I'll be back to you by next month." Michael's laugh rasped. "A neat arc," he said. "A necessary one," Lucy answered, and the bouquet's stem snapped softly inside its wrap like a bone that had quit negotiating. Alex lowered the phone, saved the file, and watched his future recalibrate into something sharp and manageable. Not a battle. He did not have the stomach to throw plates and let the internet drink the shards, but a line drawn in public where lines mattered, a place where the truth could stand upright and ask the room to choose. He tucked the phone away, lifted what remained of the bouquet, realized it was a prop for another story entirely, and set it beneath the console table as gently as if it were sleeping. When he turned, the trumpet player peeled his mouth from the instrument as if the mouthpiece had burned him. "Change of plan," Alex said, voice shockingly calm, as though he'd simply decided to move a chair. And as he detailed it, no spectacle, no slurs, no shouting, just a moment at the start when he'd lift his hand and the AV team would play a clip. Jack's expression moved from bewildered to grim to fiercely practical, the way best friends do when the world insists on being itself. They fanned out like stagehands, Jack to charm the venue tech with an extra tip and a story about timing, the other groomsman to find a cable in test levels, the trumpet player to pivot from serenade to signal if the tech missed the cue, and Alex, newly emptied and therefore suddenly capable of obsessive neatness, to gather the night into usable pieces. He made 3 short calls in the echoing hush of the stairwell. First to the AV desk, a favor to the trumpet guy who knew a guy. Second to the hotel coordinator to confirm the screens would be live before vows. Third to his mother, who answered on the second ring and did not ask for drama, only breathed with him until his chest remembered how to rise without scraping bone. "Mwana wanje," she said softly, "my child," and he said, "I'm here," and discovered that he was. When he slipped the phone back into his pocket, the recorder file sat next to the ring he'd bought with 2 months of tips and a quiet understanding that love makes bargains with reality. He pressed a steadier palm against the door and heard only the small movements of a woman at a mirror, perhaps checking the angle of her own story. He could have loved her, he thought, if loving were the same thing as agreeing to be a prop. But he'd learned in the 100 small humiliations that make up decent work that dignity is a muscle. Use it or it fails you when you need to lift something heavy. He straightened, nodded once to Jack as they reconvened at the corridor's bend, and rehearsed a new act. Ask for the mic, lift his hand, let the room hear what he had heard, and then leave without feeding the fire anything but facts. Down the hall, the heart-shaped cake sweated glaze. The trumpet gleamed like an exclamation point swallowing its own shout. The carpet ate footsteps like secrets. Alex pocketed the broken stem for no reason he could name, stepped into the elevator with Jack's palm a brief, bracing weight between his shoulders, and watched the mirrored walls return a stranger who still looked like a good man, just one who had moved from hope to clarity in the span of a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. When the doors opened on his floor, Brutus's bark rolled faintly down the hall, a single, low syllable with no theatrics in it, and Alex, who had always believed dogs are terrible liars, took that as both warning and blessing, and walked toward the suite.
The suite received him like a stage after curtain, dim, perfumed, full of props that suddenly felt accusatory. Balloons floating like captive moons, roses arranged with the arrogance of money well spent. The last night before you say I do sign shining at a brightness that made honesty feel underdressed. Lucy was in the bathroom with the shower going, pop music whispering from her phone, and Brutus had migrated to the foot of the bed where he watched Alex with an attention that felt older than the room, head tilted as if to ask whether the human had figured out the thing the animal had already filed under facts. Alex set his phone on the desk as a priest might set down a relic, copied the recording to a fresh folder in a small flash drive the best man had pressed into his palm for photos, then emailed the file to himself under an innocent subject line, menu options, because experience had taught him that truth lasts longer when it has multiple addresses. He changed out of the thrifted suit into sweatpants and a soft t-shirt, folded the jacket with the kind of care that people reserve for objects that carry them across a moment, and sat at the edge of the armchair until the room's stillness stopped pushing against his ribs. There were 100 loud responses within reach: accusation, spectacle, the mean satisfaction of breaking something expensive, but he had chosen a quieter instrument. Proof in a room full of witnesses, not to humiliate for sport, but to puncture a performance with a pen so small the story would collapse under its own air. He opened the hotel notepad and wrote a 3-line statement in neat block letters. Please forgive the disruption. I cannot marry someone who treats a human heart as content. May we all choose better. Then tucked it into his suit pocket beside the ring, whose stone looked suddenly like a patient moon. He called the AV tech and confirmed the timing. Right after the officiant's welcome, I'll raise my hand. You press play. Texted Jack a single word, set, and called his mother, who answered on the second ring with the kind of listening that does not require you to make your pain interesting, just true. I am here, she said, and he believed her, because believing someone is there when they can't fix anything is its own kind of scaffold. When he hung up, the shower cut off. Lucy sang a scrap of chorus, and Brutus huffed like a low drum, as if to say that the next part would be about steady hands. Alex moved through the suite, collecting himself by collecting objects. He rinsed 2 empty flutes and set them upside down to dry, smoothed the duvet where a wrinkle dared to suggest chaos, straightened the gift cards so their gold edges lined up like disciplined soldiers, a ritual of tidying that turned panic into sequence. Lucy emerged in a robe, damp hair coiled at her neck, eyes bright from steam and from the pleasure of seeing herself reflected everywhere, and she crossed to kiss him with a softness that might have wrecked him on another night. Tomorrow we win the internet, she murmured against his cheek, and he smiled the kind of smile that is mostly a shelter, then asked about the call as if it had not reached him through a wall, the way a careful man tests a window before leaning his whole weight on the sill. Work, she said, airy, dismissive, always the machine. And he nodded, because naming a lie before dawn rarely does anything but teach it your outline. When she fell asleep under the purposeful coziness of hotel linen,
Morning arrived lacquered in gold and nerves. The ballroom washed in chandelier light, so bright it looked like optimism had been polished overnight. String players tested shy arpeggios. The planner floated like a benevolent ghost, tabulating contingencies. And the venue's social team whispered countdowns at cameras, riding their rails like discreet predators, while guests in creams and metallics drifted toward their seats, murmuring the universal pre-ceremony questions. Isn't she stunning? Is he ready? And the aisle's far mirror, Alex saw a man who had learned, sometime between midnight and dawn, that calm can be worn like a suit. He walked to the front with Jack and the groomsmen forming a quiet constellation just behind, shook the officiant's hand, and took his place without the bounce that had once defined his steps. The screens ringing the room slept in a tasteful black. The AV tech raised 2 fingers from his booth, ready, ready, and somewhere near the 3rd row a bulldog huffed from beside Lucy's stylist, Brutus's barreled chest rising and falling as if he too had an opinion about vows. Then the doors at the back opened and the room inhaled. Lucy entered on her father's arm, looking like a solution to a riddle about light, her gown throwing constellations across the parquet, her train a white road no one dared step on. Phones flowered in unison as she came, each guest wanting to hold a piece of the fairy tale between their fingertips. At the altar, she leaned in, breath sugar-sweet. Deep breaths were golden. And Alex, who had breathed all night, nodded once, eyes level. The officiant lifted the leather book that sanctifies choreography. "Friends and family," he began. But Alex raised his hand, a small, courteous interruption, palms steady as a metronome, and turned, not to the bride, not to the crowd, but to the booth. The AV tech, who had been watching that hand as if it were a conductor's baton, pressed play. The first second was only room tone, a pause so clean you could hear a rhinestone settle. And then Lucy's voice, pristine and inarguable, spilled from the ceiling. "He photographs like charity. It humanizes me." A gasp rippled from the back like wind combing tall grass. A flower girl's basket clicked against a pew. The clip continued, unhurried, clinical in its logistics. Vows under the arch, kiss on cue, PR blast at 15. Monday headline. We ride the swell and I pivot. Post-nup massaged, irreconcilable differences later. By next month, I'm back to you, Michael. The name hit the parquet like dropped cutlery. Lucy's bouquet descended by gravity's oldest law, one petal loosening itself and abseiling to the floor, as if to mark the moment. And Brutus let out a single low note that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't not. Phones lowered in a choreography of disbelief. A flower girl's basket clicked against a pew. The clip ended not with a flourish, but with the soft click of a call's goodbye, proof's favorite punctuation. Nobody moved. In the kind of silence good acousticians crave, Alex stepped forward, returned the mic to the stand like a fragile thing, and spoke only once. "I wish you well." He did not turn it into theater. He did not enumerate sins or read statements or lecture a crowd that already knew which way was up. He simply nodded to the officiant in apology, to the room in gratitude, and to Jack in the kind of wordless exchange that says thank you for being the person with the cable when I needed a cable. He stepped down from the dais and walked the aisle at a humane pace, near enough to hear bracelets settle on wrists, near enough to smell lilies cooling in their water, near enough to see 3 different kinds of pity try and fail to land on him. He kept his eyes on the doors so that the screens, now black again, wouldn't pull him into their gravity. Behind him, the wedding shattered, the way a glass does not simply break, but becomes a dozen separate stories. The planner reaching for a clipboard, as if order could be remade by bullet points. The quartet lowering bows, as if sound itself had become inappropriate. Guests standing, then sitting, then standing again, as the etiquette of catastrophe failed to load. Lucy's father touched her elbow and met nothing. She had become statue still. Pupils widened, a strobe of shame moving across her face like cloud shadow over surf. Outside, salt air greeted Alex like a first, clean truth. He reached into his inside pocket and felt the triangle of notepaper and the ring and the flash drive, tools he had used, drawn, and survived. And Jack caught up with a hand on his shoulder that said no words but carried them, then pulled him into a quick, bracing hug that rocked both men 1 inch toward equilibrium. By the time they reached the curb, the first #RunFromLucy posts were already mid-upload in a dozen shaky hands, and the venue's social team, suddenly facing the wrong kind of virality, stared at their monitors as if the pixels might apologize. Alex didn't look back. He walked into the bright, ordinary day wearing the kind of quiet that makes onlookers lower their voices. And the ocean, unconcerned with hashtags, kept breathing in and out like good.
For a week, Alex learned the choreography of going nowhere while the city tried to make him a destination. Reporters orbiting the hotel, notifications blooming like a rash, acquaintances texting variations of, "You're trending, bro," as if virality were a casserole you set on a grieving man's porch. So he did the only unremarkable thing he could think of and went back to the cafe where rent is paid in foam and patience. In the morning, he dialed in the grinder until the espresso ran like a string of dark pearls. In the afternoon, he wiped the same strip of counter until it reflected a thinner man. At close, he counted tills with the calm of someone who needs small arithmetic to keep the large numbers of his life from shouting. And when customers recognized him, they practiced two faces, compassion and curiosity, before choosing the latter and asking for selfies he did not give. "We don't photograph grief," he said once, gently, to a college kid who blushed hard enough to learn something. Nights he walked the boardwalk, where salt air makes liars honest, letting his body move the way thoughts do when they're tired of being stared at. And on the third evening, rain starting in a fine script, a traveler ducked under the cafe awning as he turned the key, backpack softened by miles, boots truthful about puddles, a camera that looked like it had slept rough and woken faithful. "Closed?" she asked, already smiling at the answer. And because kindness is a muscle that responds to use, he unlocked the door again and brewed 2 Americanos without announcing it as charity. They drank them standing by the pastry case while rain wrote louder on the glass, and she introduced herself as Emma, a documentarian between jobs and maps, happy to be no one's headline. She didn't recognize him or behaved like she didn't, asking questions that start in the weather and end somewhere you can set your hands down. Where he learned to pull a shot this steady, an old manager with a metronome and a temper. Why the cafe plants rosemary in the window boxes, because people forgive burnt toast if something smells like a garden. Whether he's ever watched the way steam lifts off cups like small private ghosts. Yes, every morning at 6. And he answered because answers felt like moving oxygen from one room to another. She left with the thrift store umbrella he kept under the counter and a promise to bring it back, which she did the next day, along with a story about missing a train and finding a view that felt like an apology. And soon their days established a forgiving tide, Emma arriving in the gold hour when the cafe's noise thins, Alex pouring whatever he had left of warmth into clay mugs, conversations widening to include music that never makes playlists, recipes that live only in the hands that taught them, the way some losses make you smaller and some make you exact. And still, he did not tell her about the ballroom, or the clip, or the hashtags, because he wanted, greedily and rightly, a space where his face wasn't immoral. On a Wednesday, a boy spilled a peppermint mocha in a catastrophe of sugar and green whip, and before Alex's reflex could reach the mop, Emma was kneeling with napkins, laughing the kind of laugh that demonstrates there are disasters worth enjoying. And the boy's mother, who had recognized Alex and been building a question like a tower, forgot her script and said, "Thank you," and meant only that. Outside, the news cycle rehearsed new disappointments. Lucy's team issued statements that softened verbs and erased nouns. A brand partnership paused. Michael was photographed exiting a private club with a singer whose eyeliner did sue for damages. And the internet, having eaten enough of itself for breakfast, moved on to lunch. In the lull, Alex noticed that his appetite had returned for unimportant decisions. Whether to switch the house blend, whether to reorder the mugs by height or by comfort in the hand, whether to tell Emma about the ocean path that blooms with morning glories if you catch it before the dog walkers. And he did tell her, which is how they found themselves one Saturday walking a blue path toward a bluer horizon, trading silences that felt like agreements. Brutus appeared once on the boardwalk tethered to Lucy's stylist, who paused as if manners could unknot history. And the bulldog recognized Alex with a thump of tail that carried no gossip, only the uncomplicated hello of a creature that judges by scent
and steadiness. Alex scratched the broad head and said, "You were right, not to reopen anything, but to close it well." And for the first time, the memory of the ballroom tasted less like iron and more like weather that had passed. Back at the cafe, Emma left a small notebook on the counter. Inside, a sketch of him tamping grounds with a caption that read, "Simply steady." And he stood a moment longer than necessary with the gift open in his hands, recognizing without needing to name it that a door had been opening very quietly for days and he had finally stopped leaning against it. That night he slept without rehearsing the worst moment of his life, woke to ordinary sunlight, brewed the first pot, and when Emma returned at noon, camera slung across his chest like a question she wasn't in a hurry to answer, he said, "Do you have time after close?" And she said, "For what?" And he said, "Something small," which turned out to be the kind of small that rearranges the furniture in your chest to make room for a table set for two.
Consequences didn't arrive for Lucy like a thunderclap. They seeped under doors, rewrote calendar invitations, and changed the temperature of rooms that used to warm at her entrance. First, a brand manager's email with "reassess" doing too much work in the second sentence. Then a fashion house "press pause" that sounded polite until her publicist translated it into the only language that matters in that world. Not now, maybe not again. She woke to fewer blue ticks and more unread think pieces written by strangers who had decided her arc was an essay prompt about authenticity. And while her team drafted statements that massaged verbs into passive voice, private conversations have been misinterpreted, narratives taken out of context. The clip did what clean proof always does. It didn't argue, it just played. And people who had wanted to believe in love felt personally conned. The internet moved on in headlines, but not in feeling. Rooms cooled by 2 degrees, hosts forgot to tag her, a charity gala reassigned her table to someone less likely to start a conversation about optics, and even the kindest acquaintances deployed that special tone reserved for friends who had made a mistake no one knows how to hold. Careful, distancing, unsalted. At home, the penthouse did what expensive spaces do under emotional weather. It became echoey, full of the sound of one person rehearsing explanations to furniture. Lucy wandered from kitchen island to window wall with a mug that went cold too fast and refilled too often, while Brutus followed without judgment, nails clicking a steady metronome across perfect floors. He no longer climbed on the white couch. Somewhere along the line, the old indulgence had felt wrong to both of them, and instead chose the rug by the door like a sentry who hadn't clocked out. "I'm not the villain," she said to no one in particular, which is what villains love to say, then winced at the thought's meanness and sat on the floor to meet the dog's eyes at dog level, rubbing the thick fur between his shoulders until her breath evened. The phone vibrated with a lawyer's name. "We should settle costs with Mr. Ndluvu quietly," the voice advised, "and stop the bleeding." "There's nothing to settle," Lucy said out of reflex. "We miscalculated public appetite for ambiguity," the lawyer replied, which was an elegant way of saying the room believed Alex because he had asked for nothing but the mic. Later, Michael texted a master class in cowardice. "Hard week. Keep your head up," following it with a photo posted from the back of a car with someone whose eyeliner could start a petition. The caption used the word vibes like disinfectant. Lucy typed a paragraph that toggled between rage and wit, deleted it, typed a 2-word apology to Alex, deleted that too, then opened her notes app and wrote, "You can lose a story and still find yourself," which felt like a fortune cookie until she said it aloud and heard the part that wasn't fake. She tried repairing the narrative the way she'd always done. Meetings, PR chess, a long sit-down interview with lighting she could almost forgive, but every tactic presupposed an audience, waiting to be convinced. And these days, even the mirror had questions. In the glass, she saw a woman who had learned to treat people as resources, and then been surprised when a person decided not to be mined. Brutus snored a bulldog snore, ridiculous and grounding. She laughed in spite of herself and then cried because laughing felt like stealing. She scrolled old photos, red carpets, balcony mornings, Alex grinning in a thrifted suit that had loved him back, and understood in a way that hurt that she had confused admiration with intimacy and strategy with care. You can really like how someone photographs and still be unkind to the person holding the face. Her mother called from a quiet kitchen 4 time zones away and did not offer spin, only soup recipes, and the family's unglamorous advice. You can be right or you can be kind, but only one makes you someone people want to sit next to on hard days. I wasn't right, Lucy said, surprising them both. I was efficient. Then be something else now, her mother replied, and hung up because some truths should be left to ring. Lucy put her phone face down and picked up a bucket. The hotel had called needing extra hands after an investor dinner, and she had offered to help because contrition is a verb or it's nothing. She changed into black slacks and a faded tee, tied her hair back without caring about angles, and let the elevator deliver her to the unphotographed part of the building where broken glass is not metaphor, and red wine stains require knees. On the service floor, the air smelled like lemon and work, and the manager handed her a mop and forgot to perform surprise that a woman from billboards knew how to ring one, and she joined a chorus of soft jokes about blisters and shoes that lie, a democracy of effort she didn't remember she had missed. In the ballroom, after the lights dimmed, she saw 2 figures she hadn't planned for. Alex at a coffee urn, steady as a metronome, and Emma beside him, marking cups with a thick pen like a kind accountant of warmth. And Lucy felt her pride try to bolt, then saw Brutus pull slightly toward Alex, which is how she decided to keep moving, to wipe, to listen to the way ordinary work quiets the parts of your brain that write press releases. When Alex noticed her, he didn't flinch or perform, just gave a small nod that moved like a permission. You can exist here without being a headline. She gave one back that meant thank you for the plainness of that. And for the first time since the clip, she understood the punishment wasn't cancellation or comments or paused contracts. It was something more necessary and therefore more painful. The task of becoming the sort of person you'd have to be if you wanted a dog like Brutus to thump his tail for you without conditions, and the sort of person who wouldn't mistake a good man's quiet for smallness ever again.
The ballroom, after the investor dinner, sounded like dishes exhaling, ice settling in silver buckets, cutlery chiming the final small arguments of the night, staff laughter thin with fatigue and relief. And in that hum, where glamour had already left the building and only labor remained, Lucy came through the service door with a mop and a face scrubbed of angles, Brutus close on her heel as if he'd been promoted from pet to conscience. Alex was at the coffee urn refilling air pots with the unshowy precision of someone who respects heat. Emma beside him, drawing little suns on the lids with a marker so the night crew would know which pot was the strong one without having to hope. For a beat, all 4 paused, man, woman, dog, as though an unseen stage manager had called hold. But no lines were dropped because none of them had come to perform. Lucy nodded first, a small tilt that said, I can stand here without collapsing or claiming center, and Alex returned it with a nod of the same size, which is a rarer kindness than forgiveness, because it allows the other person to be ordinary. The manager, delighted by fresh hands, pointed Lucy toward a red star of wine fanning into the carpet where a tray had gone to pieces earlier. She sank to her knees without ceremony, and the woman next to her, someone who had been on her feet for 12 hours and had earned the right to be sarcastic, handed over a stack of microfiber cloths and said, "Press, don't scrub. It spreads if you attack it," a sentence that doubled as advice for the rest of Lucy's life. Brutus circled, lay down, and produced a bulldog sigh of such comic gravity that 2 bartenders grinned out loud. Emma, who had never been in a room with 3 versions of a story coexisting so quietly, offered the marker to a passing busser and came over with a tray of clean glassware, setting it near Lucy so she could ferry shards without slicing her hands. "Thank you," Lucy said, meaning it the way thirsty people mean water. "You're welcome," Emma returned, and neither woman tried to launder the moment into a TED Talk about growth. After a while, the kind of while that only work can measure, the red gave up its grip on the fibers, and the glass was tamed into a safe glitter in a bin. Lucy stood, flexed her knees, and crossed the few feet to where Alex was wiping down the urn's chrome, like a man polishing a mirror he intends to tell the truth in. "I was cruel," she said. Not a preface to a justification, but the whole sentence, said carefully on the table between them, like a cup you don't want to spill. Alex met her eyes and let the words land without catching them with a joke or a sermon. He said, "You treated me like content," and the sentence did not accuse so much as inventory what had happened. He added, "I hope you find your way," which was both a benediction and a boundary, and she nodded because anything else would have been a negotiation, and this wasn't that. She turned to Emma with something like curiosity uncoiling where defensiveness usually lives. "I didn't know how to be real in rooms that ask you to be a brand," she admitted, a truth that sounded like a key rattling uncertainly in a lock. Emma, who had built a practice of pointing her camera at small, honest things until they confessed to being beautiful, shrugged in a friendly way that didn't flatten Lucy or inflate herself. She said, "Try smaller rooms. They'll tell you when you're faking." Brutus rose, ambled to Alex, pressed the heavy architecture of his head against Alex's shin, and wagged once, a slow metronome of approval that ignored the internet's appetite for conclusions. Alex scratched the soft canyon between the dog's ears, then scratched once more for the part of himself that still needed witness. The manager clapped twice, grateful, and dismissed the extra hands with vouchers for staff meals that tasted better than apology because they came with salt. Lucy handed hers to the dishwasher who'd missed break, which wasn't sainthood, but was audible to the room as trying. On the way out, under the blue hum of exit lights that make everyone look equal, Lucy stopped beside Emma as if asking permission from the new geometry. "I'll pay for the coffee service," she offered to Alex, attempting repair without purchase. He shook his head. "We're even," he said, which did not mean balanced, only that the next steps belonged to different roads. Outside, the loading dock smelled like rain arguing with concrete. A box truck coughed to life. A neon sign across the alley blinked through its own small crisis of commitment. And the three of them, 4 counting the dog, who always counts, stood in weather that didn't need their names. "Take care of yourself," Emma said. And Lucy smiled a tired, unphotogenic smile that nevertheless looked like a beginning because no one was holding a phone to trap it. She clicked Brutus's leash, and the bulldog gave Alex one last bump of the skull, a secular blessing, before following her into the kind of night that turns press releases into laundry, and tomorrow into work you can do with your hands. Alex and Emma watched them go without triumph, the way you watch a ship leave harbor after a storm. You're glad for the movement. You don't pretend the ocean owes anyone calm. And when they finally headed back inside to close the urns and stack the cups, their fingers found each other in that absent-minded way that means the body has decided something true before the mouth writes a paragraph. Revenge, Alex realized as they clicked off the last light, had been a word too loud for what he'd done, which was simpler and harder. He had told the truth in public, then refused to live there.
Alex proposed on a Tuesday that smelled like oncoming rain and clean espresso. The cafe closed early, chairs tipped onto tables like parentheses around a private sentence, a single strand of warm bulbs riffling reflections across the pastry case while Emma wiped the chalkboard into a small black night. He didn't kneel right away or rehearse a speech bigger than their breath. He only stood at the counter where he had once learned the patience of foam and took her hands like a man steadying himself before a beautiful view. And then, because the body knows the choreography of truth when it's ready, he bent to one knee and opened a small velvet box that looked modest until the light found the stone and made a quiet galaxy inside it. "Emma," he said, Voice even the way you hold a cup with two hands. Please marry me. Let's build the kind of home where ordinary days are enough. And she laughed and cried at the same time, an unphotogenic, perfect sound, and said yes so quickly it felt like a word that had been waiting in the room all along. There were no trumpets, just the soft clap of two dishwashers who had pretended to forget their keys, and the barista who had stayed late to mop as a pretext for witness. And afterward, the four of them ate employee meal pasta from to-go bowls at the counter, passing a jar of Ollens like a chalice, talking about nothing in the relieved tone of people who've watched a storm march past and finally decide to name the sky blue again. News of their engagement didn't break the internet because it wasn't trying to. It braided itself through the neighborhood instead. Mrs. Okello from the flower stand tucked a handful of freesias into Emma's palm for luck. The piano teacher 2 doors down played something bright that evening with his windows open, and Jack, who had the emotional range of a border collie and the camera skills of a well-meaning uncle, took photos that were out of focus in all the right ways and texted them with a caption that was just 6 heart emojis and a coffee cup. Alex's mother cried into a dish towel over a pot of beans and said a prayer that included the ocean and a bulldog because she believed in thorough gratitude. And when Emma called her mama, the older woman laughed the way people do when they recognize the sound of their family expanding. Revenge wasn't the right word for what Alex had done, and he could say so now without flinching. That word was loud and theatrical and smelled like gasoline, while his choice, in hindsight, had been surgical. He had invited the truth to stand up in a crowded room, and then he had walked out with his dignity and his silence, leaving spectacle to those who needed it for rent. He did not Google Lucy anymore, did not track the temperature of rooms she entered, did not turn Brutus into a symbol. And yet when he saw them weeks later by accident, Lucy in plain clothes outside a clinic where someone had written "Be kinder" in chalk on the pavement, Brutus thumping his tail once as if to say, "I remember calm," he lifted a hand and she lifted hers, a semaphore for nothing more complicated than coexistence, and the world did not tilt or hush. It just continued, as worlds do when people decide to stop auditioning for each other's stories. The wedding they planned was smaller than the room that had broken the internet, and kinder than any headline. A courthouse morning with a suit that fit because life had taught him to choose without apology. A dress Emma found in a second-hand shop that seemed to have been waiting for her ribcage specifically. A lunch afterward under a fig tree behind the cafe where bees auditioned for sweetness and were paid in crumbs. Jack cried openly. Mrs. Okello officiated the toasts like a conductor, and the ring looked less like wealth and more like a promise that liked its job. Later, when they unlocked the cafe for the evening shift, they left the bouquet in the window where everyone walking past could borrow a petal's worth of luck. Work resumed because beginnings feed on routine. Invoices, beans, a leaky gasket, a "closed for love back at 3" sign that made 3 teenagers leave a glittering congratulations in chalk, and plans that fit inside a notebook. Expand the pastry case by 2 shelves, paint the back wall a color with the audacity to be cheerful, put 2 small tables by the rosemary boxes for people who need to talk privately or read publicly or propose without witness. Nights they walked the ocean path and learned each other's inventories, her impulse to save receipts, his to save jars, her habit of humming before she answers, his of counting breaths before he says something that matters. And when they finally slept, it was the kind that tastes like earned quiet. The internet, having fed itself to satiety on other people's noise, never came asking for second helpings of their life, and they did not offer any. The story's hook belonged to a door and a voice and a room full of light, but its grace belonged to the after, two people making a home not out of spectacle, but out of steady, human-sized days, the kind where a Tuesday is